For almost 3 centuries, one small silver coin held the greatest empire the world had ever seen together. And then, within a single human lifetime, that same coin fell apart in people's hands until it was little more than a worthless lump of bronze. Think about that for a moment. Not a war, not a plague, not a barbarian army at the gates, but money itself, quietly rotting from the inside. This is the story of how the Romans slowly, almost accidentally, printed their own downfall. It is the story of emperors who had to pay 500,000 soldiers and kept paying them with coins that were worth less and less every single year. It is the story of the day an ordinary Roman needed a whole bag of coins just to buy the bread that one coin used to cover. And it is the story of a warning, 2,000 years old, that sounds uncomfortably familiar today. If you have ever quietly wondered whether the money in your own pocket could ever simply stop meaning anything, then stay with me and hit subscribe, because what you are about to see is something almost every great power eventually goes through, and we are going to watch it happen, step by step, in slow motion. So before we watch it fall, we have to start at the beginning and understand what Roman money actually was. Here is the strange thing about Roman money. It was never really meant to run an economy. When we think about money today, we imagine it flowing through everything: wages, savings, loans, the price of a coffee. We assume the whole point of it is to keep the economy moving. The Romans did not see it that way at all. To them, minting coins had one purpose above all others: to pay the bills of the state. And the state had enormous bills. Emperors had to fund armies, build roads and aqueducts, put on spectacular games for the public, and keep the grain flowing into the city of Rome so that ordinary people would not riot. Coins were the tool that made all of that possible. The emperor spent them into existence. They passed from soldier to merchant to farmer, and eventually a good portion of them came back to the treasury in the form of taxes. That last part mattered more than you might think. Because taxes were paid in coin, the emperor actually wanted money circulating out in the provinces. The more coins moving around, the easier it was to collect what he was owed. So money was not really a gift to the economy. It was a loop, spent by the state and quietly pulled back by the state. But one question decided everything. Why did anyone accept these coins in the first place? Part of the answer is trust, the simple belief that the coin in your hand would be worth just as much tomorrow as it was today. And part of the answer, the part the Romans cared about most, was the metal itself. A coin was valuable because of the silver or gold inside it. And in the early empire, that silver was very real. The main workhorse of the system was a small silver coin called the denarius, and under the Emperor Augustus, it was almost pure, roughly 98% silver. When you held one, you were holding something with genuine, physical worth. You could melt it down, and the metal alone was worth carrying. That reliability was why a Roman coin could travel thousands of miles and still be trusted by someone who had never seen the emperor. That is the crucial idea to hold on to as we go forward. Roman money rested on 2 things at once: a fragile human feeling called trust, and a hard physical fact called silver content. As long as both stayed strong, the system was almost unshakable. Which raises an obvious problem. Keeping all of this running was extraordinarily expensive. And to understand why it eventually broke, we need to look at the single largest expense the empire ever had to pay. By the early 3rd century, almost 500,000 men stood permanently under arms, and every single one of them expected to be paid. Picture the sheer scale of that. 500,000 soldiers, spread from the misty forts of northern Britain to the burning edges of the Syrian desert, guarding thousands of miles of frontier. This was, by far, the largest standing army the ancient world had ever seen. And an army that size does not just cost money. It devours it. We do not have a perfect budget for the Roman Empire. No emperor ever published a neat spreadsheet. But the best modern estimates point to something staggering. In a normal year, somewhere around 70% of everything the state spent went straight to the military. 70%. Not roads, not temples, not games, but soldiers. So where did all that money go? Part of it was simply wages. A common legionary earned roughly what a skilled craftsman back home might earn, enough to live on, enough to feel it was worth the risk. But officers were paid far, far more. The higher up the chain you went, the more dramatic the salaries became. until the officer class alone was swallowing a huge slice of the entire payroll. Emperors quickly learned that a well-paid army was a loyal army, and a loyal army often decided who kept the throne. And wages were only the beginning. You also had to feed these men, clothe them, arm them, and move them across the empire whenever a war broke out. In peacetime, that was expensive. In wartime, the costs could explode almost overnight as the treasury scrambled to supply troops marching into hostile territory. For a long time, the Romans could actually cover all of this. Fresh silver and gold poured in from two reliable sources: the mines the empire controlled, especially in places like Spain, and the plunder taken from successful wars of conquest. As long as the mines kept producing and the legions kept winning, there was always more precious metal to turn into more coins. But think carefully about what that really means. The whole system quietly depended on growth. It depended on conquering new land, capturing new treasure, and digging up new metal. It was a machine that had to keep expanding just to pay for itself. And that raises a quietly terrifying question. What happens on the day the conquering stops and the mines start to run dry? Because when the fresh silver dried up, an emperor was left with only two real choices, and both of them were awful. He could delay paying his soldiers, which was a fast way to get himself murdered by his own men. Or he could start quietly cheating the coins themselves, making them with less silver inside. For almost 250 years, Rome managed to avoid that terrible choice. And the reason it could was a single, remarkably trustworthy coin that the entire ancient world was happy to accept. Set the wars and scheming emperors aside for a second, because Rome also pulled off something genuinely remarkable, a stretch of stability that almost defies belief. For roughly 2.5 centuries, the denarius just worked. Think about how extraordinary that is. Empires rose and fell, emperors were crowned and stabbed, wars were won and lost, and through all of it, one small silver coin kept its value, with almost boring consistency. A merchant in Gaul, a soldier in Egypt, and a landlord in Rome could all reach into their purses, pull out the same coin, and agree, without a second thought, on exactly what it was worth. That shared agreement was quietly one of Rome's greatest achievements. It knitted 3 continents into a single marketplace. You could carry your wealth from one end of the known world to the other, and it would still be honored because everyone believed in the same silver. Trade flowed. Prices stayed calm. Ordinary people could plan, save, and lend without lying awake wondering what their money would be worth by next winter. In fact, people trusted the denarius so completely that it traveled far beyond Rome's own borders. Roman silver has been dug up in the markets of distant Germany and in staggering quantities across southern India, where local traders eagerly traded for it. A coin stamped with the face of a Roman emperor had become something close to a global currency, accepted by people who would never live under Roman rule, simply because they believed the silver was good. Now, it was not completely frozen in place. Small changes did happen. After the Great Fire that gutted Rome, the Emperor Nero trimmed the coins a little, shaving down their weight and lowering the silver just slightly. Over the following generations, the silver content of the denarius drifted downward too, slowly, almost invisibly. But, and this is the important part, none of it really mattered yet. The reductions were so gentle and trust in the coin was so deep that people barely noticed. The system absorbed these little nicks the way a strong body shrugs off a scratch. The denarius stayed rock solid in the one place that counted most, the minds of the people using it. And that, more than any army or any mine, is what truly held the empire together. Not fear, not walls, but a shared unspoken confidence that a Roman coin was as good today as it was yesterday and would be just as good tomorrow. It felt permanent. It felt like something that could last forever. It could not. Then, almost overnight, the world the Romans trusted began to break. It started, as these things often do, with something nobody saw coming. Around the year 165, during the reign of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, soldiers returning from a campaign in the east brought home more than victory. They brought a disease. We cannot say for certain what it was, though many historians suspect smallpox. What we do know is chilling. The sickness spread along the roads and rivers the Romans had built for trade and troops, and it tore through the empire for years. The great physician Galen, who lived through it and wrote about what he saw, described the fever, the black rash, the endless dying. By some estimates, the plague killed as much as 1/10 of the entire population. Whole towns emptied. Fields went unworked. Army units lost so many men they could barely stand. Now think about what a disaster like that does to money. Fewer farmers meant less grain and less tax. Fewer workers meant less trade. Fewer soldiers meant the frontiers suddenly looked dangerously thin. The empire was earning less at the exact moment it was about to need far more. Because the second blow landed almost at the same time. Along the Danube, in the cold forests of Central Europe, a coalition of Germanic tribes came pouring across the border. These were not small raids. This was a serious invasion, deep into Roman territory, and Marcus Aurelius had no choice but to march north and fight. He spent the rest of his life at war. Year after year, campaign after campaign, on the freezing edge of the empire, trying to hold a line that kept threatening to snap. And war, as we have already seen, is the most expensive thing an empire can possibly do. So picture the emperor's terrible position. On one side, a plague had gutted his tax base and thinned his ranks. On the other, a grinding war was draining money faster than he could bring it in. To pay for it all, Marcus is said to have done something almost unthinkable for a Roman ruler. He auctioned off the palace treasures, the imperial furniture, the jewels, even his wife's silk gowns, selling them in the forum to raise cash for the troops. The auction, ancient writers tell us, dragged on for 2 whole months before he finally called it off. Let that sink in. The emperor of the richest state on earth was pawning his own belongings to keep his army paid. That is how tight things had become. Marcus, to his credit, held the empire together. He beat back the invaders and steadied the frontier. But he did it by scraping the treasury down to the bottom. When he died, he left behind a state that had survived, but only just, and a treasury that was dangerously, frighteningly empty. And this was the trap now closing. The soldiers still had to be paid. The wars were not truly over. But the easy money, the plunder, and the steady flow of silver was gone. Every honest option had run out, which left the emperors staring at that one dark solution they had avoided for centuries: the coin itself. Hold a Roman coin from this era in your hand, and you are holding the evidence of a slow-motion crime. To the naked eye, much needs to change. The coins are still round, still stamped with the emperor's proud face, still called by the same familiar names. But the story is not on the surface. The story is in the metal. And if you could melt these coins down, decade by decade, you would watch something quietly horrifying unfold. Go back to where we started, and the denarius was almost pure silver, around 98% under Augustus. Now move forward to the Emperor Septimius Severus, near the start of the 3rd century, and that number has slipped to roughly 50%. Half silver, half filler. Keep going a few more decades, into the terrible years around 270, and the silver has almost vanished completely, down to just a few percent. The coin that once held an empire together had become, in all but name, a lump of bronze. Now, the emperors were not stupid, and this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. They knew people watched the silver, so they got clever. Take the Emperor Caracalla. Around the year 215, he introduced a shiny new coin, the antoninianus, and declared it was worth 2 denarii. The catch? It only contained about 1.5 times the silver of a single denarius. In other words, the state was quietly charging you 2 coins worth of value for 1.5 coins worth of metal. It was a tax you could not see, hidden inside the money itself. And what people did next was beautifully predictable. The moment people realized the new coins were worse, they started doing something very sensible. They kept the good old silver coins at home, buried in jars, tucked under floors, and spent only the cheap new ones. The good money vanished from circulation, and only the bad money kept moving. Economists have a name for this pattern. They call it Gresham's Law, the simple rule that bad money drives out good. Then came the cheapest trick of all. To make a nearly worthless coin still look valuable, the mint would coat it in a thin skin of silver, a technique that left a delicate silvery layer sitting over a core of base metal. From a distance, it gleamed like the real thing. But it was a costume. Underneath, it was mostly copper. And every Roman who scratched one, or watched that thin shine wear away with handling, understood exactly what was happening to their money. People were not passive in all this. As the coins got worse, ordinary Romans and forgers alike began shaving tiny slivers of metal from the edges, a practice called clipping, and passing the lighter coins along. The state fought back, chasing counterfeiters and tinkering with designs, but it was a losing battle. When the official money is already fake in spirit, it is very hard to convince anyone not to cheat. Which brings us to the most human question of the whole story. Did the emperors actually understand what they were doing? Did they grasp that they were setting off an inflation that would eat their own empire alive? Almost certainly not, at least not the way we would explain it today. They were desperate men, lurching from one crisis to the next, reaching for the coin because it was the only lever within reach. Each small debasement felt like survival. Nobody was planning the collapse. They were simply postponing it, one shaved coin at a time. By the reign of Claudius Gothicus, around the year 270, the process had reached its grim conclusion. The everyday coin was essentially bronze, wearing a silver wash so thin it amounted to maybe 2% of the whole. The metal was gone. And once the metal was gone, there was nothing left to hold up the one thing that had truly mattered all along: trust. And when that finally shattered, the numbers stopped making any sense. Imagine a soldier opening his pay at the end of a long year of service and slowly realizing that the coins in his hand can no longer feed his family. This is where the whole story stops being about metal and starts being about people. Because once ordinary Romans understood that the money was hollow, they did the only rational thing left. They stopped trusting the numbers stamped on the coin and started asking a much older question. How much actual silver is in this thing? And when the answer was almost none, the coin was treated as almost worthless. The result was a spiral, feeding on itself. The state, desperate for money, minted more and more coins. On some days, the imperial mints were pouring out more than 1 million pieces, flooding the empire with cheap metal. And the iron rule never changes. When you have far more money chasing the same amount of bread, wine, and cloth, prices do not stay still. They climb. Then they run. Then, in the worst years, they gallop out of sight. Think about what that felt like from the ground. A merchant who sold his goods in the morning could not be sure the money he took in would buy the same goods by evening. People began to refuse the official coins altogether and quietly return to something older and simpler: barter. Payment in grain. Payment in anything that could not be faked by a mint. The government even started demanding some of its own taxes in goods rather than cash because it no longer trusted the money it was printing. And the people crushed hardest were the ones who could least defend themselves. The soldier on a fixed wage. The widow living on a small pension. The city family that bought its bread rather than growing it. Their savings, if they had any, quietly evaporated. A lifetime of careful storing, gone, not to a thief in the night, but to a slow rot they could see but could not stop. Then, near the year 300, the Emperor Diocletian tried to do something about it. And what he did tells you just how frightening the situation had become. He issued a sweeping law we now call the Edict on maximum prices. It set a legal ceiling on the price of well over 1,000 different goods and services, everything from a measure of wheat to a day's wage for a painter. And the penalty for charging more than the limit was not a fine. It was death. Now weigh that carefully. The empire was so afraid of rising prices that it was willing to execute a merchant for selling bread too dear. It was the ancient equivalent of trying to hold back the tide by making the tide illegal. And of course, it did not work. Merchants who could not sell at the fixed price simply stopped selling. Goods vanished from the open market and slipped into the shadows, into black markets, where the real prices were higher than ever. Diocletian had commanded the numbers to behave, and the numbers had ignored him. Before long, the edict was quietly abandoned, a monument to how little raw power can do against a broken currency. This was the low point. An empire that had once minted the most trusted coin in the world could no longer make its own people believe in money at all. It seemed like nothing and no one could pull Rome back from the edge. And yet, out of this chaos, one man was about to try. A soldier born into a poor family who would claw his way to the throne and decide that he was going to fix the money itself. His name was Aurelian, and he came to power at the very moment the empire seemed ready to fall apart for good. He was not born into luxury. He was a career soldier, tough and fearless, who had risen through the ranks the hard way. And in just 5 years on the throne, he did something that had seemed impossible. He reunited an empire that had literally broken into 3 separate pieces, hauling the breakaway territories in the east and the west back under a single ruler. The grateful Romans gave him a fitting title: Restorer of the World. Naturally, he also turned his attention to the money. Aurelian launched a reform of the coinage, cleaning up the mints and issuing new coins with a clearer, more honest standard of silver. It was a genuine attempt to rebuild confidence in Roman money. But the hard truth is this: it did not really hold. You can restamp a coin overnight, but you cannot restamp trust. Once people have watched their money betray them, they do not simply forget. Real stability would not return for another generation, under Diocletian and then his successor, Constantine. And this is where we reach the deepest lesson of the whole story, the part that goes far beyond metal and mints. Because the debasement was never really the disease. It was only the symptom. Underneath it all, Rome had been running on a very particular kind of engine, one that depended on constant expansion. For centuries, the empire had paid its bills with fresh conquest, with the plunder of new territory, and with a steady supply of enslaved people captured in war. As long as the borders kept pushing outward, the machine had fuel. But once the conquest stopped and the empire settled into merely defending what it already had, the fuel ran out. There was no new treasure pouring in, only enormous costs going out. Debasing the coin was simply what a bankrupt system reached for when the growth finally stopped. The other half of the lesson is even simpler and even more human. Money is not really made of silver or gold or paper. It is made of belief. Rome did not fall because it ran out of metal. It faltered because it ran out of faith in its own promises, and faith, once broken, is agonizingly slow to rebuild. There is one striking footnote, though. The story did not end the same way everywhere. In the eastern half of the empire, Constantine introduced a new gold coin called the solidus, weighing about 4.5 grams. And that coin did what the old silver never managed to do again. It held its value, not for years, but for centuries, quietly anchoring the wealthier Eastern Empire long after the West had crumbled. So the Romans did, eventually, relearn the thing they had forgotten. That sound money is not a luxury. It is a promise, and an empire lives or dies on whether people believe that promise. They learned it the hardest way imaginable, in blood, in hunger, and in worthless silver. Which leaves us with one uncomfortable question, staring back at us across 2,000 years. Have we actually learned it too? In the end, it all comes down to one idea. An empire is never destroyed by a single coin. It is destroyed the moment its people stop believing in the promise that coin represents. Rome did not run out of silver. It ran out of trust. And once that faith was gone, all the silver in the world could not have bought it back. What is truly unsettling is how familiar that sounds. Every time you hear about prices climbing, about money buying a little less than it did last year, you are hearing a faint echo of a story that is almost 2,000 years old, and it is still being written. If some part of you feels like we are watching a version of this same story unfold today, do me a favor. Just leave one word in the comments below. Again, that is all it takes. And if this made you look at the money in your pocket a little differently, a like genuinely helps more people find it, and subscribing means you will be right here for the next empire we take apart. Because there is a twist that Rome never understood. Not every empire mastered money by hoarding silver. One rainy little island did almost the opposite. It built the largest empire in history on paper, on debt, and on other people's precious metal, and somehow, the very things that ruined Rome made it stronger. Sit with that for a second. The exact weaknesses that rotted Rome from the inside became, in another empire's hands, the secret to ruling a quarter of the planet. It sounds impossible. It absolutely is not. It is the strangest reversal money has ever seen. How that happened is the missing half of everything you just heard. That story is already waiting for you, right there on your screen.